All right. Good morning and welcome to those who are in early. We're just giving a minute here to let some latecomers and some other people log in. So welcome, sit back, relax, and we'll get started here in just a minute. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and jump in. Welcome again. Welcome to Safe Simplified. What we're looking at is, right, how do we take this big ominous thing called safe and can we break it down into some of its basic elements to understand why an organization would use it and what are some of the basic tenets and principles that are behind it, right? To kind of take something that can be very complex when you first look at it and really understand its place in the market, its place in business, and its place in the agile space. All right. So my name is Robert Shaw. I'm an enterprise agile coach and trainer with Clearly Agile. I've been in the software business, right? It says 20 years now. I think it's over 25 now. I'm a certified scaled agile program consultant. Have been involved with SAFe and the SAFe community since 2008. Implementations, training, etc. As well as working day to day with clients and consulting on, adopting and implementing agile and agile practices. Right. So chances are you've seen this, right? The SAFe big picture, right? It's kind of this wonderfully, beautifully done infographic that's kind of done as an effort to describe like what is SAFe and what does it do. And at first glance, it can be overwhelming. It can be intimidating. It can be unsure understanding how all the pieces fit together. I know back in 2008 when I first started looking at it, I'm like, this is beautifully done, but what is it? What does it mean? Right. And I think without having a basic understanding of SAFe, right, it can be confusing to navigate. Right. Is it a team framework? Mostly no. And, to some degree, yeah, we have agile teams represented down here, right? What we think of as traditional Scrum and traditional Kanban. But that's not the sweet space, right? SAFe kind of requires good Scrum, good Kanban, good teams as part of the backbone, right? But when you drop back and you think about what it's supposed to do, it's more accurate to describe SAFe as a framework that helps you run an agile organization, right? What are all the other pieces and mindsets that need to go into play to help support, align, and get those teams delivering the most concentrated value possible, right? So while it does include what we think of as traditional agile, it's much more to it, right? So I think Mike Kirstein gets this right? He gets right to the core of the problem, right? For the why SAFe, right? We have this collision between old business operating, old business thinking, and this emerging, growing technology-centric customer and culture, right? Where the old ways and new this collision between the old ways and new expectations are really forcing companies to take these drastic shifts in how they operate, how they think of delivery, and even pushing on some of those older practices that used to run companies tried and true for decades. They're reaching a point where they're not as effective as they were before, right? And it need to shine this new light, new path on how to do that, right? For some, it's essentially learning how to thrive in this new age, and for other organizations, it's downright a case of flat out survival, right? Knowing that what's coming, they're not equipped to operate. right? So I think some organizations are out there addressing it naturally and kind of more at a grassroots organic level, and that's awesome. More often we see organizations really struggling trying to make sense of what does this new world look like? How do we need to operate and deliver in it? And the truth for them is the clock is ticking, right? See, SAFE does a really good job at framing this for organizations, right? Where we are today, right? If you think about all the ages and revolutions that we've gone through, right? What we're at today is what they're referring to as the digital age. All right, we'll see this here, right? It's something that really started in the 70s, and likely hit its turning point somewhere around the dot-com boom in the mid to late 90s, right? And what shifted there was software is something that some people use or businesses use to software and digital assets is something that everybody, consumers, everyday people going through their lives use, right? And I think around that time, we also saw Agile starting to emerge, right? And where Agile was changing how we build software, right? In many ways, we still see companies and organizations still trying to manage teams and work and what they produce using practices that were developed from mass production or even those earlier ages, right? And it's starting to push in this need for rapid adaptation, right? And the reality is that collision between old and new causes some struggles, right? We know agility is where customers are going, the expectations are changing, um, but right, that's not how people were raised and how business was thought to be done, right? So there's this opportunity of presenting a new way of thinking, a new way for businesses to operate, right? If you just think about it, right? Think about how your own technology expectations have changed, right? What are you expecting today versus what were you expecting just 5 years ago or 10 years ago, right? We've sort of crossed that point, that turning point where it's no longer a nice option, right? It's actually expected. And if an organization isn't competing at a technology or competing with competitors, right, it's seen as a negative, right? And that's kind of what they're referring to at the turning point, right? Something changes in the market where it goes from something that's kind of cool and something nice to, why don't you have this? Why does your competitor have this? Why aren't you embedding technology? Why aren't you communicating with this? Why is it taking so long, right? And with that, we usually see this reduction in patience from the consumer, right? And all that is sort of negative things that start to impact businesses, right? Again, I love that quote there in orange, right? The problem is that organizations are using the management frameworks and infrastructure models, old ways of thinking to try and navigate this new age, right? And I think we're also seeing this play out in smaller startup or entrepreneurial companies, right? They've kind of grown up in a world where they're already embracing this, right? So SAFE kind of targets or likes to target the companies that are looking to radically shift and transform their way of operating, right? Kind of status quo into how do we take and modernize and start addressing and organizing and lining up our delivery to compete in this digital age, right? Now, it leads to a couple questions, right? Is it too big? Are they too late? Can a culture that size be changed? And that's kind of a core part to understanding SAFE, right? What exactly are they? What exactly are they recommending? And what do organizations need to consider when they're doing this, right? I think it's one thing to introduce Scrum teams and Agile teams and think of it as a development operation. But how do you think about it from an organizational operation, right? From a CEO perspective, right? That can be risky change, right? So we need to kind of understand that, right? Right. We see this here with John Cotter, right? He's kind of recommending something bold, right? Something new, kind of something a little more drastic, right? Saying that if you want to do this, you have to intentionally and aggressively pursue it, right? So looking behind this, right? Most companies, most organizations, even the large ones today, they didn't start out that way, right? A lot of organizations or even growing organizations started out as this entrepreneurial network, right? Not a whole lot of structure. A lot of it was focused around, right? Ultimately focused around customer centricity, right? Regardless of role or title, the customer is what's mattered. How do we innovate? How do we catch up, right? There was energy in that, right? There is a purpose in that that's centered around the company. And I think a lot of that thinking is what drives that rapid success and growth in these up and coming and burgeoning organizations, right? It's true today, and I think it's safe to say that it was true, decades ago, right? Focusing on what made you successful was focusing on the customer and the customer needs, right? That entrepreneurial spirit, right? And I think every organization, either up and coming or even today a larger organization, right, struggles with this, right? As the enterprise succeeds, right, you have to figure out how to expand. You have to figure out how to grow. And the normal course for that for decades and generations of companies has been to start putting in a hierarchy, right? To start increasing responsibility, chain of command, right? Making sure that as you're growing and people are doing the work, right, there's people there to ensure critical tasks are carried out, that expertise exists. Right, you start getting into specialties, right, versus right focusing on the customer. We have somebody focused on security, or somebody focused on marketing, or somebody focused on delivery, right? So you start getting hierarchy, and you start also getting silos in organizations. And I think a lot of it has to do with the way the previous models approach this from a leadership and management perspective, right? They kind of taught us that this was good, that you need these hierarchies. And I think when you look at manufacturing, or, back to like iron and steel age, I think that made sense to a degree. But is that where we are today, right? Right. What we tend to find is there's a typical outcome that tends to happen following that model, right? At some point, the size and weight of a hierarchy starts to crush the network and entrepreneurial side in the process, right? Some structure is good as that structure grows, right? If there's not innovation, if there's not learning new approaches, if there's not innovating within that space, right, that network ultimately sort of gets crushed. It becomes a casualty, right? And customer centricity goes along with it, right? Just on a side note, like my personal sweet spot with Safe is I love working with mid-sized companies kind of right at this tipping point. For me, I kind of see it as a useful tool, right, to be able to kind of choose a different path, right? Do you want to go down this path? By the way, typically here's what we see happens: is you lose customer centricity, you lose some of that entrepreneurial spirit, or here's something that may look different to kind of help you keep both worlds going and help the company thrive, right? So, I mean, ultimately, what this points to, right, is, right, the solution at the end from a Safe perspective is not to trash the one over the other, right? You don't have to trash the hierarchy, and it necessarily don't even have to get rid of the network, right? It's kind of to introduce a second operating system, which one would be, familiar with entrepreneurship, would be very familiar, right? It's kind of like, it's not an or, right? You can't have a network or a hierarchy, right? It turns it into an end, right? How do you capture the entrepreneurial spirit with your existing hierarchy? And I think for organizations of a certain size, certain complexity, right, that's very attractive, right? And that's kind of the pain point that they're struggling with is, right, we've become heavy, we've become siloed, work is slowed down, we've lost sight of the customer, right? It's all about process and practices, right? How do we get back to that entrepreneurial spirit, right? So Safe starts introducing and championing this idea concept of a dual operating system, right? Where you can have this physical hierarchy, but from that physical hierarchy, you can start building virtual structures within your organization, right? Virtual long-lived structures, right? Structures that have shared alignment and shared responsibility around producing and delivering around a product or a value stream, right? So in other words, create the entrepreneurial network within what you already have, right? But empower them, dedicate them, and align them towards a common mission and purpose, right? It doesn't destroy the hierarchy, it just provides an alternative, right? They start phrasing this or using terms of right, calling it a business agility operating system, right? I kind of like that. Has a nice ring to it, right? You can have a hierarchy, you can have a large company, but what we were looking for is creating a business agility operating system within there, right? And once you kind of start seeing that, and you go back and you look at the big framework, and as we go through this, hopefully we connect some more dots. But you'll start to see where the functional hierarchy lives in that map, but also where this virtual stream network or this virtual construct also lives in the map, right? They both live simultaneously in there, right? And you'll see that as we come through, right? And once you sort of understand this, right, you start to see where the responsibilities start to lie in the map, right? So at the bottom, it's shared, right? They share strategy, customer engagement, support, and creating a learning culture, right? We still have the hierarchy. There's still a more focused on revenue, costing, finances, accounting, sales, marketing, et cetera. But then if you look at the network, right, it's a single bullet, but that's a broad bullet, right? Product research, development, delivery, and evolution, right? R&D, right? Figuring out what the client customer wants, what's valuable in there, what are our options, how do we deliver it, and how do we continue to evolve it, right? A single but broad bullet on that other side, right? And I think a lot of things on that left really fall into that entrepreneurial category as well, right? That's what we want from an entrepreneurial thing. That's what mattered, right? This is the stuff that kind of tends to slow that down to a degree. So Dean Leffingwell, the creator of SAFe, right? I kind of love this phrase, right? They kind of nail it, right? No matter who you are, what space or industry in, today, 2022, you're now a technology company for the most part. Right. And I kind of laughed. We went out for frozen yogurt as a family the other night, and all of the machines had touchscreen, and we could mix flavors and we could do toppings and everything else on that. I thought it was really cool, but it kind of struck me is like we just went out for ice cream and they're running software, right? And the entire process from selecting our flavors and toppings to checking out was completely digital, right? Something you wouldn't have expected, 5-10 years ago. Right, we have shoes that communicate with our fitness devices, with communicate feedback to our phone. The largest watch manufacturer right now in the world is Apple, right? Cars that drive themselves, right? We are definitely entering the age where if you're not a software company, you're still a software company, right? Or part of your organization needs to be technology focused, right? And because the needs of the consumer are ever shifting, right? And the pace and the expectation is it's only going to get faster, right? Business agility is this layer that organizations need to start thinking within. And that's kind of gets into the crux of where SAFe has its roots, right? Business agility requires technical agility, right? What we think of from team, scrum, and delivery and producing. But it also requires business agility or business level commitments around the product and the value stream thinking, right? Both now have to be in sync, and both have to start aligning, and both have to start collaborating to achieve those outcomes, right? In short, right, everyone is involved in delivering a business solution, and many of those business solutions today still use technology, right? It's a part of the evolution, right? So I'm not going to spend time here. Where I want to go is here, right? So we are absolutely going to go into the framework and the cadence and the setup and the structures. But like any framework, right, there is a set of principles and beliefs that drive it. And I think it's good to do it as an introduction because you get to see how does SAFe try to influence this in the organization, right? What is the scope of this, and how does it frame business agility for an organization looking to adopt it? And I think they do a pretty wonderful job breaking this down to its 7 core components, right? So the simplest way to read this, right, is customer centricity is always at the center for them, right? Everything that happens in the framework, everything that happens in the training, everything that happens from an output has this edge of the customer is at the center, and we need to understand what value means to them. On the gray side, right, what we see is a lot of the technical side, right? Enterprise solution delivery, agile product delivery, and team and technical agility, right? What makes it go from a delivery standpoint? But I absolutely love that on the other side, in that beigey yellow color, right? What we see is a organization, right? You have equal stake in the game, equal skin in the game, right? How and what we manage in our portfolio, how we choose to invest, what we choose not to invest in, requires you to be involved, requires you to participate, requires you to help us prioritize and steer the course, right? We need to know where we're headed, where we're changing, and what's important and what's not. Right? Organizational agility, right? It's all about culture, right? Not just not just having uh, training around culture, but how do we start to build lean agile leadership inside of there, right? And then supporting from an HR perspective. We'll go into these real quick. We're going to do a quick pass through them. But that also involves creating a learning culture, right? So we don't stagnate along the way, right? Stagnation is kind of one of those things that got us here, right? How do we put an empirical learning process and a learning culture in place so that's continuing ongoing, right? So most of these you'll notice have breakdown into multiple tenets, right? So lean agile leadership is exactly that, right? It's as an organization, it's teaching the leaders and putting them through the paces to start to understand what it means to manage and lead in an agile environment, right? It's the mindset shift, but it's also the tapping into the intrinsic motivators of staff and people, right? Being able to tap into that, being able to lead by example, and then how to be a catalyst for leading the change, right? That's always probably the stickiest part, I think, going through this is, there's want, and then there's I understand how to do that, right? So when we start looking at things like the Safe Agilist training or the Leading Safe training, right? They spend a lot of time working with leaders in that training of saying what does this look like? How do you get there? And it's okay that it's tricky. Here's how you keep it going. Right. The next principle, right, breaking that down, if you look at it, right, we have team and technical agility. Right now, a lot of this in that upper left quadrant is what we think of when we think traditional agile, right? Right. And safe really does depend on having a good foundational understanding of what it means to be a productive agile team, right? Whether it's using Scrum or Kanban, right? It is built around having high performing agile teams at the center, right? And I think just as a coach and a trainer, right, working with clients here, that's one of the things that we look at before even touching safe, right, is can we get the teams to a degree of competency where they get the basics, they get the fundamentals, they can deliver in an agile way, they can get to a shippable increment at the end, right? That all still matters and is still important in it, right? And now we start branching out on that, right? SAFE is really big on pushing this concept of building quality, right? That it begins at the beginning of every cycle, it's part of the cycle, and at the end, you have to be really clear on what quality means as an output, and it puts it in a way that the organization can understand, right? Right, of why it matters. Here's what happens when you don't have it. Here's why it's a focal point, right? That all accumulates into this concept of not just a team, right? But now as you're scaling and you're looking at more complex solutions and software products, right? Some of them having a single team is good. Some of those larger ones require a team of teams, right? One team isn't enough to support the value delivery stream for this large product or solution, right? So how do you start coordinating and aligning teams of teams together to deliver successfully? Which is probably why most people start looking at like frameworks like SAFe or Scaled Agile, Scrum at Scale, right? So you get into the product delivery side of the house, right? And now this is all about alignment, thinking, alignment, and understanding the customer, right? So we still see customer centricity around here, getting involved in design thinking concepts and how to bring that into the organization, right? This concept of developing on a cadence and release on demand, right? So in other words, right, you should have a cadence, a synchronization, a heartbeat around your activity, right? It's the glue that keeps a lot of this together. But you should also have the technical ability and the capability to be able to put that product, build and put that product out whenever enough value is accumulated, right? And I think we look at that from a single agile team perspective all the time. Organizationally, right? How does this become an organizational principle of how we build and operate and deliver solutions and software? Right? It's the same question, just kind of brought up to the enterprise level of, right, is this how we operate today's digital age? And some powerful concepts around that that help people learn and understand that, right? And I think that kind of glues together with the bottom one, where you start getting into this concept of, right, how do these team of teams support, sustain, build, and mature a continuous delivery pipeline, right? So that includes absolutely some concepts around DevOps, but also includes how to fit the customer centricity, design thinking, R&D cycle into that to get it into the flow on the other end, as well as the customer feedback cycle into the other end. Right, so they do a really nice job of starting to tie those elements in with the training and how they roll out the framework. And it's interesting just seeing differences in organizations that are doing it, right? For some, it's a slow roll. And then we start putting the framework in and something clicks at the leadership level. And then we start to see that accelerate. It's kind of an interesting paradigm that typically comes up with safe implementations, right? Solution delivery, right? I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time here. But this is SAFE's nod towards what if you're really, really, really big as an organization? What if you have multiple portfolios with multiple organization lines, if you're a large government institution, right? And you still need to keep some level of coordination and alignment across there. One of the examples I like to use here is NASA is a SAFE organization, right? They're launching and developing rockets and space programs using this, right? And they have multiple programs and multiple initiatives and multiple points of coordination and suppliers and contractors, right? Is there a way to do that in using lean and agile techniques, right? At that level, is it pure agile? No, right? It's in there, but it's also starting to leverage and pull in a lot more lean aspects to it as well, right? And trying to find the synergy between where those worlds collide in these really, really large project spaces, right? You get a focus here on product portfolio management, right? So really getting a handle in the organization on what it means to be a product, right? Where does a product or products come together for a solution? How does value flow to the customer? How do we as an organization decide when something should go into R&D or when something should be sunset? Are we basing that on a feedback loop that includes development, includes the customer, and includes success ratios? Are we on top of these decisions as an organization? Right now, there's a lot I could get into here that would probably chew up many, many hours of a webinar. But what I like about this is it doesn't overly complicate it, right? It looks a lot on there, but these are actually very simple patterns and paradigms that put the alignment and synchronization back into the organization in a way that it kind of helps them visualize the decisions, helps them visualize where things are in their product horizon, helps them understand and contextualize when something is generating revenue and when something is towards end of life. How and when to start MVP type prototypes and how to decide whether or not it's successful in the market or to reject it and invest and fund something else. I love the way this frames this for the business. I love the way that it frames this for the business leaders. And in some degrees, it simplifies and demystifies some of that for them in complex organizations. Some of the first times we just kind of do these as visual exercises. They're like, I never looked at it like that, right? That's simple. Right. So there are certainly some events that happen in here, and maybe it's a future topic or deep dive just on the concept of lean portfolio management. Right. So you start getting into the last two here, right? So organizational agility, right? So this is all about developing the thinking culture and people that needs to support it, right? And I think we see this in the Agile community. I think we see this in this new digital age community of right, something needs to kind of get unstuck there, right? There's an unlearning of ways of leading and management people, and it can be scary for some, right? And we need to be able to create, train, and mature that culture inside of organizations, right? how does that happen? What are the techniques and approaches that we do to that, right? So that comes out of some of the safe training at the leadership level. But I love also getting into the strategy agility thing, right? It really does a good job at framing this, right? Know when to pivot your strategy to stay centric on the customer, right? Know when that's a bad thing, all right? And how do you visualize, get the metrics, the analytics, the feedback to actually start navigating that, right? So some really nice concepts that go in there and part of the framework, right? Lastly, this is a great nod towards the overall culture, right? So we'll talk about this briefly here, but one of the things that you'll see in the SAFE framework, if you're considering it for your organization, or even if you're doing it, right, is it puts this concept of inspect and adapt, right? Relentless improvement, right? It makes sure that it's in all layers, right? It kind of focuses on, right, in order to continue to innovate and thrive, right, we have to continually be inspecting, continually be adapting to how we're doing, right? And we see this, right, naturally from a Scrum or a Kanban level, right? At that level, the teams kind of already pull this in with a retrospective, right? But now we start to see SAFE introducing this at the team of teams level, at the program level, higher at the solution level, right? That this needs to have an organizational cadence of improvement, inspecting, and adapting, right? That's part of the culture, the DNA of how we operate in this business agility operating system, right? And then we look for ways, right, to pull in and start building learning culture and supporting things in there. Even from an HR perspective, right? Agile HR becomes a play of, right, how do we motivate, inspire, incentivize people to have the right type of agile and lean behaviors that gives us the culture we want, right? It's a broad topic, typically covered in the leadership course, but it's also addressed at some of the other courses as well, right? They kind of hit this relentless improvement culture thing all the way through, right? And I think it's really, really important in the success there, right? So now, right, we kind of talked a little bit about the why and how they're framing this business agility operating system, right? And that's kind of the messaging that leadership hears, right? If you're in this pain point of needing transition, right? What are we touching, right? How are we structuring? What are we touching, right? And now we start pivoting into the how do we operate side, right? And uh, SAFE is an empirical system, right? It does have inspect and adapt. It does have learning baked into it, right? And with most empirical systems, we see a need to start talking about alignment, cadence, and synchronization, right? It's kind of those things that help base on when and how do we adapt, right? When and how do we get feedback, right? And I think I love this graphic, right? This is something referred to as organizational drift, right? Right, at a certain size, many companies struggle with executing and delivering on strategic goals, right? We kind of see that. You may be in an organization that does that. They get cast out there and it's like, we're going to do this by the end of the year. And 2 years later, we're on our way. We're still going, right? So what happens there? And I think a lot of organizations today struggle with organizational drift, right? They kind of put that out there, and then all this other stuff kind of creeps in from a direction standpoint. And where we were heading down this target, right, we get this slow drift towards something else, right? We deviating from that plan, or other stuff has usurped it along the way. SAFE's approach to addressing that organizationally is like, no, you need to put something in there, a checkpoint, an inspect and adapt point frequently, right? That lets you kind of course correct back to where you think it's going, right? And that should favor a shorter time frame, and that should favor a shorter time frame. It should allow for absolutely should allow for adjustment or alignment or learning around the strategy, right? But it shouldn't be something that's left unchecked, right? It's not a right. It kind of, I guess I used to say hope is not a strategy, right? We don't set it and hope we get there, right? You get what you inspect, not what you expect, right? So we want to kind of make sure that along the way we're checking in. Is this still the goal? Yeah. All right. How do we get back to that? Is this still the goal, right? How do we get back to that? Has something changed? How do we get back to that? right? And the goal is not to nail the original plan, right? The goal is to continue aligning to reduce the amount of deviation, right? To stay on target for what that objective is, right? And I think it's an important part when you're talking about dealing with, 20, 30, 40, 50, 100, 150 development teams in a larger organization, right? You sort of need to keep that as a focal point, right? Now, when we talk about structure, right, I think it's safe to say that we would all get the concept that value does not flow up and down through silos or in an organization, right? Or does not flow quickly up and down through silos through an organization, right? And I think that's a structure a lot of companies are challenged with facing today, right? But sort of things have to go up and down the business hierarchy and up and down the product hierarchy and up and down the development hierarchy and up and down the quality hierarchy. Right. That's where a lot of the process lives. That's where a lot of the practices live. That's where a lot of the thinking about this is our space and our domain lives. Right. I mean, the reality is, if we were to take any product, any solution, any offering that a company has, and draw a line around it, what we would see is that just about everything an organization does cross cuts across those silos. Right. We need to be able to pull expertise and knowledge from all of those to be able to go from concept to cash in any solution in any organization, right? It's interesting is if you kind of think, if you're familiar with Scrum and you take the Scrum concept of a team, right? We say that a team in Scrum is cross-functional and it contains all the skills needed to deliver complete value and a working product increment, right? The same concept applies here, right? In order to deliver a solution, a complex product, a complex solution, right? We need a cross-silo team that contains all the skills and competencies that are needed to understand, plan, and deliver value for a customer, right? And it's safe, we know that the value flows slowest when it has to move up and down, right? So how do we address that, right? How do we avoid the turf wars, the politics, the old policies, right? Right? So one is we align around something called a value stream, right? And it's really a mapping exercise that we do that helps organizations understand, right? This is from a customer perspective. This is what the journey is. These are the people and the organizations and the skills that are needed to do that. These are the products and the solutions that are part of that journey, right? Let's understand what it means. And right, an organization can have one of these. Large organizations could have two or three of these, right? So for example, if you just, banking is the simplest example, right? We think of banking as consumer banking. I have a checking and a savings account. I have an ATM. I have online banking. Banking also has mortgages, which is a separate P&L center, a separate business, a separate value stream, right? The act of engaging as a customer through receiving product and getting the bank getting paid is different. Auto loans, personal loans, investing, right? So even a bank can have multiple value streams inside it. And we need to understand what's there, what are the skills, what are the products that are products or things that support it, and then how do we start aligning people with shared responsibility to that to maximize output, right? Right, and this is where that dual operating system comes in that we talked about, right? So kind of connecting the dots back to that earlier slide, right? So in SAFe, you will often hear the term agile release train. And when I first thought, I'm like, all right, cool, trains. My son loves trains. Awesome, trains are good, right? But agile release train, right, is not a stop of putting value delivery on a schedule. Agile release train actually came from the term of getting everybody on board, right? And what it does is it builds this virtual structure that is empowered to act in an entrepreneurial way to support the full value stream, right? So from the hierarchy builds this virtual entrepreneurial team, right? And it can have leadership roles, traditional, leaders from the hierarchy. It can have teams within the hierarchy, right? But they are all charged with this common mission to focus on delivering customer-centric value along the stream, right? So we kind of take that same cross-functional team concept and say, nope, you're now a cross-functional train. Now, typically, right, it's 50 to 100 people on a train, right? So it's not just like one or two teams. We're talking teams of teams and those that are needed to support it, right? So we usually see anywhere between 5 to 15 teams. And in order to do this, there's a couple of key agile release train roles. We're going to talk about those next. But it also includes the identifying the business stakeholders, customer stakeholders that need to be involved in this, right? We want them involved. We want them to participate in delivering value, right? So whenever we see we did agile release train on the graphic, right, that's referring to a collection of people focused on delivering value around the same product line. Right now, we often see roles, right? I think roles are on the left-hand side of that big picture, right? And if we just want to make a quick parallel, right? If you're familiar with Scrum, Scrum introduced us to some specialty roles, right? You had the development team, but now we had the Scrum Master, right? The person on the team that helps the team learn, operate, and implement Scrum to its fullest capabilities per the Scrum Guide, right? Now we have the product owner, right? The person who is the single voice responsible for representing the business and the customer and prioritizing the backlog to optimize value at the other side. Those are fantastic additions, right? Now you blow that up and you start scaling that up, right? You're going to need new roles that come in, right? We don't take away the old roles. We just have new roles, right? And we see over here, we have a release train engineer. And the way to think of that is the chief scrum master on the train, right? They have the responsibility to make sure that the train is running and operating in the best possible way, right? That they have the best practices, they're implementing the best practices, they're getting the right outcomes, even to some degree helping coach and guide the teams underneath on the practices that they're executing on, right? So I kind of think of them as chief scrum master, super scrum master for the train, right? Their responsibility is just for the collection. To the right of that, we have the product management, right? Product manager, right? So easiest way to think of that is the chief product owner, right? If you have 5, 10, 15 teams and each of those have a single product owner and you're trying to get to a complex solution, right? You need somebody who can view the big picture of the direction of the product, what that means in the market, to the customers, to the business, and helps orchestrate and keep that glue together, right? Product owners still retain autonomy down at their segments or sections of the backlog with the team. But a lot of that is a collaborative, coordinated event back with product management to help kind of keep the big picture in line with the organization, right? We even see that sometimes when we're just scaling a few teams is, right? Sometimes a product owner needs to run point, being able to see the big picture for just a few teams, right? So very similar parallel there. Right now, if you're talking about complex enterprise level software, it starts to get a little bit harder to avoid architecture and engineering practices. Right, a lot of times there is a high degree of customer expectation on quality, sound architecture, performance, and engineering that goes into it. On an agile release train, there is typically somebody in the system architecture role, and now this is not designed or meant to be kind of an ivory tower architect that dictates this is what the architecture is. They're more responsible for setting general architectural direction, helping make decisions on whether or not practices, techniques, and the platform tools that they're being used align with where they're headed, setting some architectural paradigms, also some quality and validation and system integration paradigms. All right, and they're in service to all the other teams. Sometimes also identifying where there are opportunities to lay down architectural runway ahead of the teams, right? So if an organization with a large product has a large initiative coming up, right, sometimes that may need to lay down some foundational stuff so the team can continue to build on top of it, right? So kind of a guidance, oversight view, directional view, as well as responsible for identifying architectural runway down the road for some larger objectives coming up and how to implement it, right? One of the things that's unique, I'm going to say it's unique, it's uniquely called out on an agile release train, right, is struggling with DevOps integration, maturity, and integrating many teams into one single working system at the end of it. SAFe puts the system team inside of the agile release train with the specific purpose of no matter where their starting point is with DevOps integration maturity, right? They're responsible for the glue that all these other teams are going to start using to build on, right? Laying that down so other teams can pull it into their practices. So at the end of this, right, we start getting more the ability to more rapidly and frequently integrate and build working software along the way, right? In fact, that agile principle does not change, right? The greatest measure is working software. The only thing that changed is the complexity with the number of teams needed to get the job done, right? So to sustain that SAFe is like, nope, you're going to need a systems team helping the teams do that quickly and maintaining a high degree of quality, right? And then, of course, right, you have the business owners, right? The stakeholders that are key to steering, having the direction over which direction the train is pointing, right? Also key takers of feedback. They're there to help serve the team by clearing roadblocks, impediments, and runway, running down risks. They have an active role on an agile release train, which I think is good, right? Because idle stakeholders and business owners usually cause chaos. SAFe does a wonderful way of starting to get them involved and participating in it, right? And then, of course, down at the bottom, it's not on here, right? We have a number of really awesome Scrum and Kanban teams, right? So, right, when we take this agile release train, right, if you were just to think about, right, a small number of teams, right, you take 2 or 3 teams working together, cadence and synchronization is helpful, but it's not really necessary, right? So if one team's working on 2-week sprints, they're probably okay, but they're also working with another team who's doing 4-week sprints, right? There's probably a small enough number of contact points where these guys can integrate, talk, and figure out how to get to working software at the end, right? A little bit harder, absolutely, not too bad, right? But when you start thinking SAFe organizations, right, we're not talking about 3 teams, right? We're looking at 5, 10, 15 teams delivering complex software solutions, right? And you start looking at this and you're like, okay, right, can we actually get to working product or solution at the end, right? Do we figure out how to integrate? Right at the far left of that, right, the question of, all right, what are we working on and how is it helping us get to the end goal where this product needs to be, right? You start getting these bigger questions at the end of, right, will it work? Will it solve problems? And is it the right thing? And did we work on the right thing? And that's where I think, right, SAFe kind of starts to highlight it is, right, you start getting into dependencies, you start getting into the slowest component on the train drags down how fast you can get to feedback, you start getting into integration problems, you start getting into milestones not quite lining up, right? These are real challenges when you're developing enterprise level software, right? Can it be done without a framework? Sure. And if you have the right culture, you can absolutely go down that route. There are ways to do that. If you don't know where the starting point is, right, there's some things that you can do to start integrating that, right? And SAFe starts introducing that, right? So from an art perspective, right, what we see is this focus on a cadence and a synchronization, right? And they're related, but not the same, right? Cadence here refers to the heartbeat, right? The team operates on a schedule, on a heartbeat, right? It's predictable. People, teams in the organization understand what it is, when it happens, and what those events are. Inside of that heartbeat, there are points where the organization needs to come together to synchronize and align, right? We need to do some cross-functional planning. We need to do some cross-functional integration, right? So along the way, we have a heartbeat. And inside of that heartbeat, there are times where we need to pull and synchronize to make sure that we're aligned, right? So two separate things that are in there. If you think about it, just kind of make some parallels, right? We already see Scrum applies cadence and synchronization, even just within a team, right? We have a sprint, right? A sprint is a 4-week or less cycle that repeats, right? And it has a beginning and the end. Right? At the beginning of the cycle, we have sprint planning. At the end of the cycle, we have a sprint review and we have a retrospective, right? There is a cadence that repeats for that team. Inside of that cadence, right, we have synchronization where you have sprint planning, right, where you have the product owner of the team and potentially even, subject matter expert stakeholders, right, involved. Here's what we're planning, right? Synchronization, we have that daily with the daily scrum as the team gets together and figures out how do we serve the sprint goals today, right? You get to the end, right? And in that cadence, we have the demo and it's like, hey, stakeholders and customers, here's what we did. Let's get your feedback. What do we need to adjust next, right? So the concept is very, very similar when you start looking at how SAFe applies it within the art, right? So there are a couple of things we're not going to get into, right? So one thing that's known is we actually understand what the capacity is for all these teams coming into this, right? We understand what the teams are. There's every team has a backlog. There's also a program backlog, right? So there's some unspoken things we're not going to be able to go deep on here, right? But if you look here, right, what we have here is I'm going to put these yellow markers, right? If you see these yellow markers up here, these are synchronization points. This big yellow one actually represents a big planning synchronization point called PI planning event, right? And we kind of see that marked out here at the bottom here, right? And then we have these little synchronization points that are also in here. There's more, right? But what you start to see is an organized heartbeat that tends to happen, right? Something the entire organization can sync to, right? And if we notice, each team on here is iterating on the same time length, right? So what in SAFe, what we do have is a fixed sprint length for all the teams operating on it, right? We do that so that we can get the synchronization points in, right? So if the team is doing all their sprint work, right, the first thing that we see here is this integrated system demo, right? So not only are teams building working software here, if they are working on a larger system, we want to make sure that we have the ability to deliver a working system, right? And we integrate back up to a working system and do a system demo, all right, at the end, right? So we still have team and team demo, but now we're saying like, all right, if we did our job, we should be able to build a working system, right? And we have sprint iteration 2, right? At the end of it, we should be able to go back and build a working system, right? And do the demo, right? So we still have this working software check. This can involve stakeholders as well. So we're also getting feedback across the system, which we can use to adjust and correct as we go, right? And then at the end of it, right, if you think of this entire thing as just release planning on steroids with multiple teams, right, we're going to have this larger system integration demo and feedback loop at the beginning, which starts with a planning event, which starts the next cycle for the teams, right? So we have this aligned cadence and we have these synchronization points that help all the teams stay on that heartbeat, deliver, and plan on the line together on a common set of goals, right? Very, very structured in the way it approaches that, but it works well, right? Just another visual, right, laying it out differently for those that think differently, is in the middle, right? We see a traditional Scrum scenario, right? We see sprint planning, the daily Scrum, right? We see the demo at the end of the sprint. We see backlog refinement coming up. We see an iteration sprint retrospective, right? And then sprint 2, the cycle starts again, right? There's a pattern that's here, right? If you look at SAFe and its moving components, there's a lot of parallels, not quite one-to-one, right? But inside of, right, where a sprint is a container for all the events that a team does, a PI planning event is the outside container for all the events that an agile release train does, right? So it's sort of, there's some parallels here, right? Where the cycle starts off with a PI planning event, right? We have iteration planning. PI planning event is just doing this with multiple teams at the same time, right? As the team is iterating during the sprint, right? There's usually 5 or 6 iterations inside of a PI, right? The team comes together, right? We have a daily stand-up. Daily is probably too overkill for an art, but at least once a sprint, now we have a Scrum of Scrums event and a PO sync event, right? That are helping us coordinate, adapt our plans, right? It's at the team level, not the individual level, right? Across the teams, across the product owners, are we coordinating and are we focusing on, right? How do we achieve our goals? Am I giving you something? Do I need something from you? Right? Am I blocked? Do I need help with something? Right? So you see these events start to fire off as the PI is going, right? At the end, right, we start, right, there is still an integrated demo that's happening along here, but what we see now at the end, the same way we would do an iteration review, at the end of the PI, right, we're pulling the stakeholders in and say, hey, here's what we committed to, here's what we plan to do, here's what we got accomplished, here's the objectives we actually, that we finished. Let me show you working software and get your feedback on it, right? So you just kind of see that same thing parallel, just at a larger scale with a number of teams that are doing it, right? The same way you have refinement, there is a refinement that happens for all the work in the PI planning, right? This work doesn't magically appear. It kind of runs the same way refinement runs off cycle. PI planning and the prep that goes into that is running off cycle as well, right? Now, at the end of the PI, right, teams are still doing retrospectives here, right? The question here with the inspect and adapt is not how did you do as a team, but how did we do as a program, right? Were we able to inspect and adapt along the way and improve, right? So some interesting parallels that start to come up here, right? So talked about this a little bit, right? The PI planning event, this is kind of the thing most people know SAFe for, right? It's a 2-day planning event. It is everybody, referred to as big room planning. It is noisy, it is chaotic, it is powerful. I actually absolutely love this event, right? So the goal of this is to get the teams and business aligned, alignment of strategy and execution on what's possible, what's needed, and what's possible, right? This group comes out of this event with one plan for what they're executing in the PI, right? And you kind of see some of the inputs that are here. We'll talk about those here next, right? So here, right, the inputs, right? There's a vision for the PI. Right now, it's not company vision, right? The SAFe kind of prescribes this or says this is the next product vision, right? What's the next generation of the product look like? We get the top 10 prioritized features. Now, 10 is not a hard and fast number. It's kind of a suggestion, right? Some have 10, some have 12, some may have 6. You may have small features and it might be 20, right? What it's not saying there is prioritize business, don't boil the ocean, right? What's the next most important things that fits within the capacity of the team, right? PI planning happens, right? And then as an output, what we see is a list of team objectives and a list of program objectives that the team has created, right? So this isn't a push into the team. It's an ask to the team. The team figures out the plan in the team. And then the teams also work with each other to figure out the bigger plan, right? Which we kind of see alluded to down here with the program board, right? Of where do we have dependencies? How do we need to orchestrate these dependencies, right? If there's hard dependencies, they may trade work to mitigate them. Where it's just kind of a soft dependency, they may just coordinate which sprint we're doing what in so we can keep the flow going, right? There's a lot of activity that goes into it, right? As well as identification of risks and everything else, right? It's a busy thing, but it's powerful, right? This group of people comes in with a list of objectives and a vision and comes out with a workable plan that they've all voted on at the end to saying like, we can do this. Right. So really just a powerful coordination event. Right. So I talked about these briefly. I'm just going to hit on them just 10 seconds here. Right. During the plan, right, the plan is not a black box. During the plan, we actually have coordination among the scrum masters and the product owners on, right, do we need more information? Do we need to adjust something? Do we need to deprioritize something? Does the team need more information? Right over here, the scrum of scrums, are we handing off dependencies, deliverables, and other stuff along the way, right? That has a heartbeat to it, right? And at the end, right, coming down to the last functional slide here, right, there is the system demo, right? We bring stakeholders and the teams in, product owners show working system, right? We actually measure progress quantitatively and quantitatively at the end of this event. And then we get into our problem solving workshop, right? We have a big retrospective with everybody, right? So it has this empirical cycle built in. It's a large portion of it, right? So really, right, if you're on some level of evaluating it, right, what does the next steps look like, right? It's actually, SAFe does a nice job of having something you can, right, the implementation roadmap that you can use to talk to your organization. I will say this, a lot of it in the beginning is training focused. We want to make sure that the leaders get trained. We also want to make sure that the people running the teams also get trained and they understand what's going on, right? There's also training specifically around the RTE and the program manager role and even the lean portfolio, right? But this sort of culminates to prepping for the first Agile release train launch and the series of activities that go into that, right? What is our value stream? Who are the people needed? What are the people on the art? Let's go through training. Let's prepare the art to launch. We're going to launch our first PI cycle, right? Then we get into inspect and adapt cycles, right? So there's kind of a guideline or a roadmap on how to go from nothing to your first Agile release train, right? So the framework itself is flexible, right? There's a very simple configuration, right? What you're looking at the big picture is everything. And there's ways to scale that down to just essential or portfolio level, right? So it has some flexibility baked in. A little bit of self-plugging, right? We do self-consulting or safe self-consulting. We do safe consulting, training and coaching on that. I've launched multiple agile release trains or helped organizations do that throughout the years. We also have 2 leading safe classes coming up, one in August on the 22nd and 23rd, and one in September on the 19th and 20th, virtually online delivered, right? Also, all right, just next month in this webinar series, we have Rachel Schumacher doing a webinar on overcoming transformation roadblocks. That's a good topic. It should be really interesting because we all hit them, right? They're out there. And that is September 15th, again, at this 11 o'clock time slot. So with that, thank you for sharing your morning with me. Thank you for attending. And I'll hang out for a few minutes. If you need to go, thank you. And if not, hang out to see if anybody had any questions. But thank you.